Mattachine was court jesters back in the day when they had noblemen. You couldn't go in and say the king was sleeping with a different woman, or you couldn't make jokes about, the corruption or whatever was going on as gossip. But the court jester, the Mattachine, could come in and say a clever joke, which everyone would laugh at, because it was like telling the truth, but doing it in a way that wouldn't get your head chopped off or yourself hung. And that's where the name Mattachine comes from. Jesters who dare to speak the truth.
Stonewall was not the first uprising for the LGBTQ community. There have been different uprisings that were kind of spontaneous, like Stonewall, that happened before that. There were also organized events that happened, like Julius's sip-in. Julius's bar is just a few blocks from here. And so they actually went with a photographer to the bar, the Mattachine Society, which was actually housed out of one of the buildings right by Stonewall, right here on Christopher Street. And they took a photographer with them and openly declared that they were homosexuals, because at that time, New York City, the liquor license, you couldn't get a liquor license in New York City if you served openly to homosexuals. So to kind of fight against that, they actually would go from bar to bar to bar, openly announcing it and taking photographs to hopefully get media attention for it. And Julius's bar, just a few blocks from here, they refused to serve them. And so, the photographer took photos, and it actually helped to overturn that law, which was one of the first victories for the LGBTQ community right here in New York. There was also Cooper's Donuts. There were a bunch of different uprisings that happened.
LGBTQ history has always been a part of American history. It's just that it's been hidden, or it hasn't been explored. So when I went to school in New York City, we learned American history. We didn't learn anything related to LGBTQ history that was a part of the American story. And I can give you examples of the kinds of things that were missing. So when I was in school, I learned about the Black Civil Rights Movement. I learned about Dr. Martin Luther King. I learned about the 1963 March on Washington. But I never heard of a man named Bayard Rustin, who was Dr. King's chief mentor and also the principal architect of the 1963 March on Washington. And the reason I didn't hear about him was because he was openly gay at a time when nobody was openly gay. He was thrown out of the Black Civil Rights Movement twice and found his way back and became one of the most important people in the movement. But we were never taught about him because of who he was. And the story is really interesting because the FBI tried to discredit the March on Washington by spreading rumors that Dr. King was having an affair with Bayard Rustin. Now, as an 8th or 11th grader, when American history is taught, I would have loved hearing that story, but that story is not taught. And if you ask most high school students today, they never hear about who Bayard Rustin was.
And so when I came on, the lead ranger, Jamie, was asking me if I knew what Stonewall was. I'm not from New York, so I didn't know. It's not really taught in schools, LGBTQ history.
As I've come to understand from my work, when we look at history, we tend to look at history through our personal lens, a contemporary lens. And we don't take into account what the conditions were like on the ground for the people who were living that history way back in 1950 or 1955 when the first gay rights organizations were formed. We call them gay rights organizations. They didn't call themselves that. We call it a movement. They didn't call themselves that. It was a very modest effort. And until 1969, I should say by 1969, there were maybe 40 to 60 homophile organizations with maybe 400 activists. They had to worry about being arrested by the police. They had to worry about their jobs and the possibility of being thrown out of their homes. It was a dangerous time in which to operate. And they had no reason to believe that the world would ever be a comfortable place to do what the Gay Activists Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front did in the early 1970s.